I'm very excited to bring up to stage Luke Tucker, who is our VP of Community at HackerOne, Mark Holmes, who is the CMO at HashiCorp, and Margaret Francis, who's a COO at Armory. We are so lucky to have all of these people on stage today. We have been at companies like Roku, Chef, Docker, Visual Studio, Hortonworks, and we're going to be having a very, very good talk about connecting developer community to commercial success. So everyone, welcome. So good to have you here.
Thanks, Ashley.
So, like I just talked about, it's not just one department that connects all the dots between developer community and commercial success. There's a huge effort across all teams. And so I'd love to kind of hear from each of you, kind of talk to me about your backgrounds, talk about what part of the monetization and community side that you've worked on, and just, give us an overview of like how you think about pricing at your current role. And then, just tell us about you. Margaret, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much for that presentation, by the way. It got me all primed thinking about this. It was really good content. So I'm currently the COO at Armory, and I run prod and engineering and go-to-market side as well. And before that, I was at Heroku, where I had a very similar function, ran all the different functions in the organization. And I think that one of the things that is really a compare and a contrast between the two different roles is that Heroku, I was there for like 6, 7, 8 years. And it was like a very grassroots product that grew up into the enterprise. It followed its users. It added enterprise and security features, a lot of which were along the recipe, Ashley, that you were kind of showing earlier. And sometimes we were even struggling to get kind of corporate and enterprise fast enough to meet our user needs. At Armory, it's very much, I would say, like a team and enterprise focused product today. And the exercise is more, how do you package it down so that enterprise developers who've loved using the Armory distribution of Spinnaker at Netflix or, other companies I can't name, right, can use it in a smaller team setting and still get the benefit. So it's kind of magical to be able to compare and contrast those two experiences.
Awesome. Thank you for that context. Luke, your monetization strategy I didn't talk about because it's so different than any other ones that I've ever worked on. And so I was going to save that one for you to give us an overview of. Because HackerOne, it's so interesting how y'all monetize, but it is not something that everyone can do, and you know that. So please tell us about that.
Yeah, well, great to be here. And yeah, it's actually even interesting the way HackerOne started. So a lot of probably the listeners are earlier on in their journey. At HackerOne, the first several years was all about the marketplace model. So we were approaching it in similar to eBay as a platform. You have buyers and sellers. We bring together companies and organizations, and we have the reputational graph and index of all these security researchers, or what we call hackers, on the other side. We connect them, and it's an incentive-driven, crowdsourced environment. So if they find a security issue in the attack surface of a company, they get paid, and the company's happy because they're more secure, and HackerOne's in the middle, and we would take a 20% cut. As we've evolved the business over time, we figured out that actually there's more services, and going up market into the enterprise as well. There's more we can do, and our customers are asking for more. So hey, we love HackerOne when you provide the creative, intellectual, humans on the other end of the screen digitally, and you bring them to find these amazing issues. This is awesome. Let's add more services. Let's have you do triage. Now we can use the platform data. And so as we've become more of a platform, I think Bill Gates had a great quote. It was like, when the value from everybody else on the platform is greater than the money you get, now you're going to be a true platform. So that's kind of HackerOne's journey, is initially marketplace. As we grew into a SaaS kind of hybrid, we still have consumption pricing within our SaaS product, but it is a fee plus bounties, and we prioritize the rewards to the community. So we're very proud to have paid over $150 million to hackers over the last 7 years or so.
Hey, Luke, I just have to say, it is not every day that I get to be on one of these panels where I'm like an active customer of the other analysts, whether it's like Mark's products or whether it's HackerOne or whether it's GitHub, even a lot of your ex products and corporations, Ashley. So like I just have like incredible admiration for a lot of the products that have been built by people on this call. Pretty good.
Yeah, same. I got so excited to talk to everybody because I'm like, I use and am excited about all of these products. And I like watch people I don't know, build some of the most incredible developer communities, and a lot of you are sitting right here. So this has been a very, very good day for me. Mark, tell to us about HashiCorp, but also like other monetization strategies you've done at all of your previous roles.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was always fascinated by Luke's business model as well. I think it's super interesting. I think, my background, actually, I was originally an engineer. And so my background, I cut my teeth as a marketer at Microsoft. And so the areas I spent my time have been sort of monetization at that kind of scale. And then having stepped into startups, I spent a lot of time in smaller startups, but generally speaking, sitting around just post initial monetization. That's kind of where I specialize. But I was also developer relations back at Microsoft too. So what I bring to the party is I'm not very good at anything, but I'm sort of okay with a couple of things. And I read somewhere once that's the right way to excel at something. If you think about HashiCorp's position in the market right now, it's taken a bunch of years. As a company, it's been around sort of eight plus years. Monetization came a lot later. So although I think most people became aware of HashiCorp probably in the last couple of years in terms of mass market, it's been around for a long time. The open source products, whether that's Packer, Vagrant in the early days, through to Terraform and whatnot, it takes a long time to get those to monetization. And I think the main lesson in trying to think about how you commercialize is don't do it too early and do it very deliberately. And repeating that pattern over a number of years has really been sort of where I would sort of identify most of the success. I would also say, generally speaking, as an engineer or ex-engineer, I try to do everything very thoughtfully. And so I think the right thing for anything is have a framework for any decision you're making in terms of community and commercial activity.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I agree that don't monetize too early. Really focus on building up the community and really focus on making sure that you have people that want to use your product and love your product, and you take that feedback. And I just, anytime someone's coming to me and they're like, we're monetizing right now, I'm like, no, build your community, take a break, think about growth from the community standpoint, and then we'll think about monetization. That kind of brings me to my next question. Obviously, when you're going into a board meeting or you're going into end of year budgeting, you're thinking about doubling or tripling revenue every year at a certain point in a startup, right? But that ties back to community metrics in a pretty interesting way. How does everyone on this call think about, beyond revenue, how are you thinking about tying that back to community metrics?
Well, I wake up every morning and I think about two things. I think about MAU on the one hand, and I think about ARR on the other. And so how do we accrue to those two metrics? Not everything is directly connected. But I like to quantify as much as you can. I think I read a book a few years back called How to Measure Anything. And I think the basic advice in the book before you go out and rush and buy it is basically just start. And so, once you sort of get that mentality into the team, you can really think about what does it mean to do softer work, such as community work, but how can that really be quantified? Sometimes it can't be directly connected to, is it precisely going to drive the end metric? But you can get a sense of the quality that you're trying to deliver through that process. So for instance, even amongst our developer relations team, we would look at how many hours on a monthly basis that they are spending in front of the community. And there's different ways to think about that, because there's some very non-scalable work. There's a lot of writing to be done. There's some very scalable work, which I might get a hit on YouTube. But in aggregate, you get this sort of sense of, is that mix correct? Are we spending enough time? Are we getting the right kind of outputs? Is anything stalling? Are we seeing the right feedback from community? And so just a lot of measurement of those sorts of internal processes on the community side. On the ARR side, we do the same, but it's much more typical. It's much more typical marketing metrics. You can imagine leads and conversion ratios and so on. How do we tie these things together? As we correlate between what we see in community, what we see in terms of that monthly active user, whatever proxies we're using for those things, and what we expect to see as commercial business on the other side. We don't tie them together truly. We're not trying to pin down a member of the community and say, let's sell you some software. We're trying to get that general sense as we see growth in certain areas. And so now's the time to put the pedal down on commercial activities around those things.
Got it. Margaret, would love to hear from you on this one.
I smiled, Mark, when you said MAU and ARR, because it's MAU and ARR. Now, you can characterize MAU in any number of different ways. It could be paid or unpaid U. It could be applications deployed, deployments, that have happened, the number, I think about those metrics in slightly different ways in slightly different situations, but it basically boils down to some variety of MAU and ARR. I think that there's a little bit of an assumption in this conversation that community means free. And I actually don't necessarily think about it that way. Neither at Heroku nor at Armory has community been as clean as there's free and there's paid. There's corporate developers and, the free spirits of the community. I think they're all individuals and they're moving out of different contexts. And very often you'll see a champion of your free or, kind of entry-level product move to a different place or, take a new gig, and they want to use the same great tools that they've used in their kind of private hobbyist life in their work setting, and they become great advocates for you inside the company. And people move around, they take different jobs, and the community ends up being something that's very fluid that way, sometimes paid, sometimes unpaid. You just want people to love your product and appreciate the value that it gives them to accomplish certain kinds of tasks, is how I think of it anyway.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also, the community not being only a free, user, I agree with that too. For me, I've always kind of worked in models where we're trying to get the free product to be kind of like the community edition, and then it shifts and it shifts back a few times. So I think it goes, it's been back and forth for me at GitHub, at GitLab. I've seen it move so many times, but I agree with you there. From a land and expand perspective, when you're thinking about revenue and community, Luke, I'd love to get your kind of feel on when you're thinking about landing and expanding, how does that work at HackerOne, and how does that tie directly to revenue or to community growth?
Yeah, it definitely will be unique for HackerOne scenario, like a lot of these kind of questions. But I think there's actually things that can be portable. So I wanted to tap on you had a slide that talked about your indie hackers and your enterprise developers, and like this is one community, and that kind of builds off of Margaret, your point too. And I see this really anecdotally as well as very specific examples in our community where many of our registered users are moonlighting as bug bounty hunters on our platform, and their day job is usually an AppSec engineer or security team lead at companies that we would want to sell into or that want to use our product, and maybe they already do. So that kind of like relationship of like, it is the program, if a program manager or a security team lead is communicating with a hacker on our platform and they don't have a good experience, then that's kind of a platform challenge. That's an opportunity we have. They still have to communicate and connect. So when those people need to have, the more they have like synergy around like identification around hackers and how they think and feel and what they want to be able to receive in that experience, the better. So when we think of like the actual community, it's all of the above. And I have a joke with our CEO that like everybody in our company, every employee is on the community team, because sales sells a deal that maybe is under budgeted or doesn't have the right opportunities, then hackers aren't going to have a good experience. If the triage team that's reviewing this report kind of doesn't handle it great, hackers have a bad experience. And it goes down the line. I can name every department in our company, product engineering, building that, moving the pixels around, building the experiences for our hacker community. So when I think of like all those elements, it kind of is just this virtual loop, and that word of mouth initially in our kind of network effect model was super valuable. We had air cover to say, let's just start and go focus on getting the top hackers on our platform, and they'll come when we get the best programs. So we got some high paying programs, and then we created this wonderful network effect. So that's kind of been HackerOne's journey and how I look at it today when I talk to other leaders in the company about how they can take care of our community. It's the customers as well.
Yeah, awesome. Margaret, do you have anything to add there?
Oh, I was just going to add, I think that once you've experienced the benefit of like a product or a community in one place, you are absolutely going to spread that knowledge to your communities, and you're going to take it wherever you go. I imagine like in the HackerOne context, once you've actually used that kind of program and you've succeeded with it, you're never going to go someplace else and not have it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why would you skip that? The same way, once you've learned how to, kind of orchestrate infrastructure, right? With like a Terraform or to manage creds with Vault, like you're like, this is just a really sensible way and a really sensible set of products to use to do this thing. And so I'm going to continue to disseminate that knowledge, and every function of the company really does build that community. To your point, Luke, it's not like just DevRel's job, it's sales's job, it's marketing's job, it's engineering's job, to kind of maintain respect for everyone's time and participation. And so if you don't care about your users, you don't care about your community, it comes back to bite you.
Yeah, I just build on that. I think that's totally true. I get a lot of phone calls, which is, hey, can you come talk to us about how we'd set up a community with business XYZ? It's like, if you're asking that question, you already haven't won here, right? So that, if you genuinely understand why a community would be useful, you've got a leg up. You've already got an advantage, because you can't just graft on the idea of community to some inauthentic position. And the same is true of my marketing generally. There's always this conversation around developers don't like marketing. That's not true. They don't like BS. And so if you don't feed them BS, it's fine. They like to be told what things do and why we think that matters to you, and they'll make up their own minds. And that's true throughout all kinds of developer marketing, whether it's community activity or commercial activity. Tell them what things do. Be rational about that. They will make up their own minds, and that gives you a lot more strength than trying to sell to them or trying to blind them with BS, for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've always said truth in marketing. When you're working with a developer community, you can't lie, and your product messaging has to be true. Like whatever is on the front web page, if that's not exactly what your product does, it is not going to go well. And so
it makes life a whole lot easier. It's because actually at this point you're talking about the trends that businesses are actually seeing. So they might not like the way you said it, but you're not trying to hide behind the idea of, I think I might have just made this up. These real issues. Yeah,
it's a very different style of marketing. So we've talked a lot about monetization and community, and I tried to talk a little bit about getting from free to paid. But I'd love to understand from y'all's perspective and your experience, when you were thinking about the free product and you were thinking about, okay, what are the paid features that we are going to ship, or what are we going to make paid features? What did that look like? Like, what were the things that made it into the paid side of the product? Luke, I think you probably have an interesting take on this. Again, the HackerOne model is so interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned at the outset, like we can't speak as much to the free to paid, although it did start where it's like you only pay us, customer, if you get results. So it's a very easy conversation, right? Hey, we'll estimate your bounty budget. You put the money in our HackerOne bank, and we're going to put the scope out, and here's what you're expecting. So respect is a key element, I think, when we're talking about marketing, to communicate to your audience on all aspects. If you alienate one side who are producing the value, or at least that's their perception as well, and you don't listen to them and you don't receive them, that's not going to be a good experience for anybody, and that will bite you down the line. When we're looking at free to paid, we do have free versions initially when we started HackerOne. So this is for everybody listening. Some of the things, like early days started, because like we didn't have much of a team. So it's like, let's just have people manage the programs themselves. Well, we kind of ran into some issues and some challenges. And so we actually added a apparatus where we'll actually be the program team in the middle to now charge you a services fee to provide that. So that's some of the evolution. But we still have today a free product. So we have a belief, and our co-founder, Alex Rice, who is a head of product security at Facebook, he's very much into that. Everybody should have a way to freely provide a security vulnerability to any company. So that's part of the core mission, is what we call vulnerability disclosure policy. 15 years ago, a hacker tries to submit a security issue, you could have the FBI knocking on their door. Today, you have platforms like HackerOne, and we want the opportunity for anybody to submit a security vulnerability. So we try and provide that free service. I think thinking about your business beyond, like, let's not just charge everybody for all these things. Let's gate all these areas. Let's do this, make it as easy as possible. Our value, the value of your company, has to come to bear in your decision framework. So we have a value called default to disclosure. If we don't default to disclosure and help provide a way for customers to be more secure and live by our mission of making the internet safer together, well, then we're going to make different business decisions. So we always have to have a free component. And then I'll let, I think, Margaret and Mark can speak more specifically to the more scenarios of the business model of those listening, can say, here's how you go from free to paid. But that's some of HackerOne's background.
I don't know, Mark, you guys are doing pretty well with this right now.
Tell us how to monetize, please.
Well, again, I'll preface this with thoughtfully. I mean, I guess there's a couple of different dimensions to it, right? And it's not like it's always right or anything. The first is that we build a lot of different products. So we have kind of the luxury of having a sort of set of progressions for those products, so whether those are just incubating products, emerging products. So we have newer things like Waypoint and Boundary, which we're hoping to gather a minimal viable audience and hopefully gather some product market fit, and we'll think about commercialization of those things. And there are others that become more mature, and quite clearly there's some compelling reason to want to buy those. And so we have that sort of feeling of a conveyor belt of those things maturing over time. That's great for us. We're a multi-product company. It causes a lot of tension because you can imagine things get complicated, but it's also great because it means we can wait out for a little bit of time to see whether things are going to work and whether they're not going to work. On the actual monetization of these things, I think one thing is important to preface as well, and I think Armory is the same, Margaret, is we don't sell up. It's not a bottoms-up selling model completely, so we're not expecting to do all of our deals by working with the community community, hoping they then buy into it. We see some of that happening, and those people become champions on larger enterprise deals. But we have a dedicated enterprise sales team who are also working down into accounts. And it's worth mentioning, because as you think about monetizing, what do you not particularly want to do generically is penalize the community for their general use of the product. And so you try not to limit on scope, you sort of limit on scale. So no one minds paying for things like team collaboration features, SSO, all of the enterprise capabilities that get you over things like compliance and governance hurdles, but also allow enterprises to actually adopt those things meaningfully in a very large scale way. But they don't like it when you say, well, you can have some, this much capability, but you're going to have to pay us for a little bit more. There are some spaces where you can do that for sure. But generally speaking, I think if you stick to the idea of scope is not commercial, scale is commercial, and the exceptions to rules and all that, but that would be my general framework.
I couldn't agree more about the scale being the thing that you really want to commercialize on. Can people use the product? Can they get the benefit out of it? And does the tax get paid when it is used in a commercial setting where scale is important is probably the best kind of single metric there. I think scale can take a lot of different forms depending on the product. So is it users? Is it the size of the database? Is it the security and compliances? Is it the SLA? Like, I'm not going to give away 5 nines to the community because it's extraordinarily expensive to deliver in any context. But I can give you a thing that's like 2 or 3 nines and has really good like transparency around when things are up or down, and that's fine. Or I can give you something that is, meets some minimum bar on security, but does not have like everything the feds need, because the feds are expensive. They're expensive for us to service as a business, So I think that paying for scale and trying to figure out how to get it right is a lot of that journey from free to paid that all of us are on all the time.
Yeah, and also you're looking for those folk to be champions, and so if you've limited their ability to use the product, how much can they champion that inside their enterprise? And so it sort of just doesn't logically make sense to get the benefits of that from the commercial side as well. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah, it's a super hard balance whenever you're trying to give everyone access to every feature so they can love it and take it to work with them, but then you also need to charge them for work. So it's a very hard thing to get right. This kind of takes me to my next question. This is like a hot topic one in my mind because I've worked in the open source communities so much, and it's kind of hard to get right. All of your companies have an aspect of like a free community version or open source version. And there's, the community does play a role in product discovery and value creation for your larger customers and the people that you're charging. How have y'all thought about that at each of your companies? And are you actively using kind of the community and the open source community to help influence what you're building for your larger corporations or larger companies that are using your product? Margaret, I think this is a good one for you.
It's a great one. The role of the community in driving kind of product development is huge every place that I have ever been. Either people are talking with you about your product, they're engaging with you and they're telling you what the needs are, or they're not. So you take something like Spinnaker, which is an open source project that was sort of born out of Netflix. And Netflix has a very unique to Netflix like operating environment. And there's certain things that Netflix does by default that are not like a common practice at any number of other like Fortune 500, Global 2000 companies. And so the community says, wow, I really want to use this open source technology, but I can't. It's missing this thing that I need to use it in my context. And now all of a sudden you have this really clear route to like, oh, that's a paid thing. We should ship that. We should make it compatible with open source or on top of open source, but we should charge for it because that's our time and effort to make this technology consumable, by the community at large. So I think those things happen all the time. And sometimes the free community and the corporate community, so to speak, the corporate user communities don't align about a thing. And those can be really kind of tricky situations because the corporate overlords tend to want more control than like the free user community wants to support by default. And those can become extremely tricky like situations to navigate, particularly when some of your code you are gifting, by open source to the community, or you're working on other open source projects. That can be tricky, but handled well, it's kind of the art to building a symbiotic relationship between free users and paid users, I would say.
Awesome. Luke, would love to hear your perspective on this one also.
Yeah, I'll add a couple a couple ways in which we do it at HackerOne, and some warnings that can be out there in terms of listening to feedback. So I think capturing it, we have 2 high fidelity ways. We have an advisory board of top members of our community that we have active conversation with. We pipe them into our core team. They're in our Slack instance. We ask some questions. We communicate. We have, hey, if you have a question, here's a product manager overseeing that. So they're able to talk through some things. And then we do biannual surveys, which is under a Hacker NPS. NPS has its drawbacks and its areas, but it's something that's worked at HackerOne to be able to be an artifact that me as a community leader can go to customer success leadership and product and engineering leadership and be like, here's what the community is asking for at scale, and here's the scientific data that kind of backs it up, and here's what the Hacker Advisory Board is saying, here's some user stories, and all the things I can bring as a conduit of understanding from my community to say, here's the lay of the land and the facts for us to make a strategic business decision based on the roadmap and everything that you see in your purview and whatnot. So I see that as 2 ways that you can replicate that model. And those are done by most customer success organizations that I'm aware of. They run a CAB and they run customer NPS things. So we just replicated that on the Hacker side. The 2 warnings are, beware the sound of one hand clapping. So make sure you don't just listen to the top 1% of your users, have a good perspective and take their feedback in. That's going to be tough because like at least HackerOne's community, we're a power law distributed marketplace. So the 1% are producing an outsized percentage of the value in our for our customers. Maybe not even Pareto's law, might be more the case in other scenarios, but you're always going to have a minority of the people produce an outsized element of the value. You got to make sure you're listening and responding and definitely managing those conversations and not just acting and taking that straight to the product leader or straight to people and be like, hey, this needs to be done because these 2 people said so. It's like, no, I'd rather cool down a fanatic than warm up a corpse, but make sure we're not just listening to that one sound of the hand clapping. So those are a couple things at HackerOne.
Yeah, totally
actually,
agree.
I was looking at my notes and I realized I'd meant to say something else entirely. That question I bet Mark can comment on, which is like how important it is to realize you're not going to deliver everything that the community wants. So you actually have to enable the ecosystem to help you. So whether that is, add-ons in the Heroku, Elements marketplace, or whether that's some of the things like Hashi's doing right now, you can't meet all the community's needs as one entity. So if there are ways that you can actually activate commercial, non-commercial partners to do things the community wants, that's where you really get to that quote you were talking about from Bill Gates, right, Luke?
Exactly.
Yes. Mark, I would love to kind of hear from you, HashiCorp, how your enterprise customers, or in your previous experience, how your enterprise customers actually have interacted with the community or like the open source community.
Yeah, I mean, they are the community to a large extent. So, so I agree with everything that everyone's saying as well. The mechanics are all familiar. We run cabs and pabs, and we have, various different apertures for various different community discussions. We'd like to get better at some of them. I think what Margaret is saying about you can't promise everything to everyone. You shouldn't be afraid of that either. And that Luke is saying, which is you can't always listen to the most vocal members of the community. And I orient that back to have a strong thesis. If you know where your product is going and you have a roadmap, and I don't develop product at HashiCorp, so I speak out of school, but generally speaking, if you have those kinds of frameworks, you can be convicted of the right feedback to the right people. So there are those out there who would change the roadmap on your product and say, well, that's not their accountability. We appreciate the input and so on and so forth. On the other hand, as Margaret's saying, you have to generate something that is going to be extensible. And so this stuff sounds obvious to us because we're all in that world where we build these kind of products, but it is non-obvious to the market generally. So if you build a provider model for Terraform, what do you know? We end up with 1,000 providers in a few years' time, and so on and so forth. So you've got to give people the opportunity to contribute there. As regards enterprise, they're open source developers by night, they're enterprise developers by day, and those things are much more acceptable inside enterprises now. And so, I'll skip back 10 years. This was really hard. Open source technology inside an enterprise was not a good thing for either as a developer, you weren't allowed to do it, but also enterprises couldn't buy it. And the procurement and legal teams didn't know how to cope with it. They weren't sure how to indemnify themselves and all this sort of stuff. And that's kind of gone away, largely thanks to things like the growth of GitHub, the massive, the ability to just explore all of these repos. And so open source just became embedded, even not at a product level, just at a technology level. So as that's gone away, you find you're talking to the same people. The people who work at our largest enterprise customers are on stage at an open source conference talking about how they did that. So they're much of a muchness. I agree they have different alignments. So sometimes they'll have very specific enterprise problems. They want you to solve that. And that's sort of off open source community roadmap. But in the end, it's all the same. We want to serve both of the needs. And enterprise communities in particular offer a whole ton back into open source projects these days.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add on to everyone's earlier point about don't build your entire product roadmap around that one loud voice. One thing I've noticed is you have to create different kinds of spaces for the same feedback. So if you're trying to get feedback about like a product roadmap, and you're doing a CAB, so customer advisory board, community advisory board, some people aren't going to speak up. Some people aren't going to fill your survey out. Do not build your roadmap around Twitter. Like, you really should think about all the different inputs and the different way people like to communicate, because I won't stand up in a CAB and give my opinion. I will write you an email maybe, but just give everyone a different way to input, because not everyone's going to be the loud voice in the room. And a lot of times, like Luke said, like, you don't only want to build for that one loud voice. So agree 100% that the enterprise developer is the person on stage at the open source conference, and a lot of that work is going back in open source and vice versa. I'd love to hear examples of a program or feature that kind of came from the community that then has, since been canonized by each of your teams. Margaret, I'm sure you have a lot of these examples from your time at Heroku and also now at Armory.
Way too many. I'll give an example around Postgres data service at Heroku, actually, and the commercialization of our Kafka offering. Like, the minute that people start asking for things like, hey, we want to do like point-in-time recovery, we want to have these certain kinds of backups, like, these are great ideas that come out of the community and they end up being really wonderful things to commercialize around. Like, now it's a managed database service that's truly competitive for some kinds of applications with, like, way overpriced technologies from, let's call it Oracle. Okay. Like, so, this is a really a big deal. Features that the community needed because they were used to experiencing them in like an Oracle context. They wanted out of like a Postgres plan offering. And when you're able to deliver them and then you're able to commercialize them for use in commercial settings, that is just incredibly, incredibly powerful. And, likewise, even in like an Armory context, you might see a call for certain kinds of integrations to, let's call it, monitoring products that are used in the enterprise. Well, community doesn't necessarily care about those as much. If you're able to deliver them, then you're able to charge for them in a way. And people can use the technology they love, even when they're using something that a corporation buys versus something that they would, kind of use for free, a Prometheus or whatever, in their own settings. So I find it very rich to get all of that product feedback from a lot of different channels, but you do have to apply your own thesis, Mark, to use your words, and your own kind of rationale to what you choose to do with that information. That's the fun product.
Yeah. Mark, I'm sure you also have some interesting examples here.
So many. When you say canonized, any line of code that's contributed via PR ends up being canonized in the product somewhere. So there's a ton of that. I'd say actually one of the interesting things back in Hortonworks days, because it was entirely a platform built around Apache projects, and so the Hortonworks data platform was a sort of effectively a set of Apache projects that was robustly tested for the enterprise in the middle. So how would I go deploy Hadoop in the broadest sense, meaning as I just deploy a set of Apache projects. And so there was numerous times where a new project would pop up. So Apache Hive and Armory and so on, some of which we would sponsor, some of which the community would sponsor, and then eventually just hit some tipping point, which is this is the feature, and so therefore it gets integrated into the platform. And so you see that in the large and the small all of the time. HashiCorp's obvious example is each product has a bunch of extension points. There are a lot of people out there doing serious work on providers, and that stuff is canonized in the path that which you use those tools inside any organization. But I think it's just one of those fundamentals. If you need to have a thesis for how that's designed into the way in which your product will attach itself to the ecosystem, the runtimes, and the methods of use inside where you're hoping for to scale and scope expand.
Yep, Luke, I'm sure you have a lot of examples from HackerOne, since your community is really the core of the business. Would love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, a couple different points and ideas. When we look at, I think there's in software development lifecycle, we want to shift left more HackerOne. So like most of what the code that is being reviewed is public endpoints today by hackers out there. Say, let's help us secure this. We want to help move them earlier on in that cycle. So kind of some of the innovation is, hey, hackers, what do you think about this? And we have hackers that get really intimately familiar with the customer's attack surface, even more so than some of their employees that are new coming on board. And so there's actually this really interesting and rich dynamic that happens when we connect them more. Our CEO, Martin, came from MySQL. And so MySQL being, open source, he has a lot of really wonderful things he published. I'll reference one that he did a blog on Amazon blog or something about the community-led innovation. And so from his vision, from board members like Bill Gurley that we have at HackerOne, we're fortunate for these really just amazing thinkers to help challenge the team to think about how do we crowdsource more. Bill Gurley's words ring in my ear when he says distributed and emergent is the name of the game. So how can we think about the problems we're doing today that we're manually, just like startups, right? Barbed wire and duct tapes, trying to figure things out, trying to build the airplane while we're in free fall. Well, as we evolve and we're in our 7th, 8th year, we're going to start figuring out ways that we can open that up to the community where they can contribute greater and better and provide this pipeline to our customers so that we're just kind of in the middle, again, kind of to that platform point. So I see us kind of building a lot of machinery around that, a lot of scaffolding still. Feels like, just like startups, there's a lot of ups and downs. So you got to celebrate the small wins when you can get them. Make sure you actually look back and realize you're on an upward trajectory. But yeah, community-led innovation, make sure there's a difference between invention and innovation. And so it's not just beakers and labs and Bunsen burners in that kind of like environment where like this is where science happens, this is where things go. Most of today is through this crowdsourced, this decentralized, this distributed creative intelligence. And so companies and organizations that are harnessing that, like everybody on this call, everybody listening, this is the future. That's power.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so we've talked a good bit about community, when to monetize, how to monetize, what not to monetize. But the core to all of our startups and all of our businesses has been the team that we work with and the team we've been able to build. And I think from all of my experience, my favorite thing with any of my startups has been building the team and working with those people. Some of my closest friends to this day are people that I got to hire, and now they're like CMOs somewhere, and it blows my mind. But I'd love to hear from each of you how, just when you think about how do you build the team, how do you like structurally build an organization to support this community growth as well as this revenue growth? I'm curious how you all think about that, and has that changed as you've gotten further along in your careers? Margaret, can we start with you on that one?
Sure. I would say I've seen a lot of different models, and you have to recognize that all models are going to iterate with stage. And be prepared for the answer that is good right now to not be the right answer that is good in 6 or 12 or 18 months. That goes for the team, the way you organize the team, that goes for the way you price the product. And you have to be prepared to thoughtfully iterate for good reasons as you go, and not settle too early into too rigid a form is probably how I would say. If you're really thinking about the value that your users and customers get and you organize to continue to deliver on that, you're okay. Just recognize whatever your answer is now is not your final answer.
Very true. Luke, what about you?
Yeah, even I think just reflecting on it does change over time. So for our just very specific scenario at HackerOne, community wasn't a division before. It was kind of nested under marketing, and that's pretty common. That's pretty typical. And community means everything to different people in different companies too. So kind of like defining terms, just like with any debate or any kind of like decision you want to make, is here's what we're defining it as today, and having that open-mindedness and that iteration, be like, what are the things we're going to look at to say, okay, I need another person here. We need to build. I need to invest in this tool to help connect them. I think coming back to, I'm going to, Mark, I'm going to steal your. It was environment, education, and experience. So if we have like these frameworks of how community is approached at the company, then it's just going to be a matter of like, okay, when's the right time to add another leader or add another layer of support or add another tool? If you can provide this community a space where they're getting together with their friends, where they're contributing in a meaningful way, and you listen to them and you're responsive to them, then the actual way that's going to happen is, it cannot just be a community kind of like problem. It has to be an area where the entire company looks at it. Otherwise, you're going to have a fractured experience, and your community is very intuitive. They sense it, and they're going to revolt, or they're going to go somewhere else and spend their time because there's something else out there. So you gotta evolve with them and your team.
Yep, agree. The community will revolt, and they will leave you if you don't do a good job of managing the community and working really, really well with them. Mark, your experience building teams. And
yeah, for sure. 100% of what Margaret said, by the way. I think that's probably one of the best bits of advice is whatever you've decided today is not going to be true in a couple of days' time, whatever your phases are. So just bear that in mind, and never be afraid to rethink those things. Never be too hasty to jump to them either, but again, thoughtfully thinking through those phase shifts for sure. From a community to me is a bit like customer success. There is community, the team, and we'll talk about that. But community is an idea. It's a concept. It's either in the company or it's not. And it's the same as customer success. It's like, yeah, there's a customer success team, but there's a whole mentality around just total customer experience that you need to kind of live and breathe every day. So at HashiCorp, developer relations, which is the overarching title to our community team, sits inside marketing. We try to keep it separate. There's a lot of commonality between how marketers think and developer relations folk think, because we all just want to do the right thing for the customer. There's a lot of brand synergy, there's a lot of events events we come together on and all that kind of stuff. But we try to keep the discussions sort of separate. So there's no sort of bending of developer relations towards commercial concerns and whatnot. So we do that. Percentage-wise, we have a really big marketing team now. It depends company to company. We have a very heavy product marketing team at HashiCorp because, well, we keep building products. But generally speaking, about 35% of our headcount is in community and developer relations, and sort of like about the same inside our go-to-market marketing. And the rest of the percentages are made up from all the sort of supporting functions, web engineering, design, brand, communications, things like that. So it's a big deal. And what you find, when you think about investment, is community doesn't scale super well. You can knock it out of the park. We have like our Learn HashiCorp experience. That's where people go en masse. But generally speaking, it's a non-scalable activity. People are writing educational content. They put a lot of craft into the sort of things they do. So you have to be prepared as a leader to sort of overinvest in headcount terms there versus other elements of marketing where you can scale out quite a lot. A lot of people get a lot of things done in general marketing. And so that's as a marketer, there's that tension. It's like, wow, quite how many headcount do we have here versus here? But something scales, something's done.
One point on scale too, Duolingo has an incredible story of them running thousands upon thousands of these English learning things by community leaders. So they build with their community by identifying leaders in these different regions that are passionate about teaching English, and then they just empower them. So there's a community team of like 6 people that manage 3,000 plus meetups every month, which is an incredible thing to strive for from that scale. So building with your community in that way is going to help address, but make sure we can't forego the headcount. And that does take a good leader to be able to make that business case for why they need to be there.
Those paths to scale are interesting. I remember from Meteor, they had, when I got to Meteor, there was one person doing community, and they had like 220 chapters of their user groups worldwide. And it was like, how are you doing this? And they basically plugged some political movement software into Meetup. And so they were managing to move a whole bunch of user group activity in the same way as you'd move people to the polls. And I thought it was fascinating. One of the community team actually went to, I think, to go work on the Obama re-election campaign as well.
I was gonna say, there's so much synergy for politics. Anybody ever been involved in a campaign? Holy smokes, these are like intense periods of really just getting people rallied around a common cause to go and do something, which is vote at the end of the day. And this way they got to vote with their code or whatever.
Yeah, we were doing this at GitHub, but when I got there, there were like, I think a team of 3 people with chapters all over the world of people throwing meetups. And we would basically just give them budgets for pizza, mail them boxes of t-shirts and stickers and whatever else we could throw in the box. And that was the best way, is just to have all these super fans all over the world and a few people managing it, because it's really hard to hire a team of 1,000 developer evangelists. It's much easier to just empower your community. And the story is always better when it comes from your community anyways, from what I can tell.
Totally. ROI on pizza, swag, and beer is pretty darn good, I think.
Yeah.
It's funny you should say that about the election, because we actually had a really interesting usage of Armory by the OpenGov team during the Biden election as well, to kind of manage Kubernetes at like much higher scale than they had done before. And I think it's that same point around like, hey, we're all familiar with this. Like we know how to run Kubernetes, workloads in production, but when we need to do it at scale, now it's time for like a commercial product, and we're already familiar with the technology. We can just kind of make that leap because now it's like time to pay, whereas it might not have been, when it was like a hobby project before.
Yeah, I want to read that story, Margaret. I want to hear. Send me that. So I'm humbled and empowered to be surrounded by such incredible leadership today. Like, I have been so excited to sit here with all 3 of you. You all bring such interesting perspectives on what we've been talking about. And also, I just respect all of your careers tremendously. And I'm excited that I already know some of you, but we'll get to know some of you more, hopefully. And one day we all get to work together. I would love that. But my final question before we wrap up is, what advice do you have for early founders who are in that, phase of their company where we have a community, we've raised some money, we've got to monetize? Like, what are the next steps towards commercialization? Like, what's that one key takeaway you think that everyone should take from this conversation? Mark, let's start with you.
A strong framework. I may mention this. So have a strong thesis on what that's really going to mean to close the first deal. So whether that is limiting projects and products, and how do you think about my SKU structure? What's the progression? What's the real model? Is it community growth truly bottoms up, or is it community growth for a point solution and then I do enterprise sales? Going into it with a strong thesis like that is the right thing. Terrible advice I've seen is get me 1 million monthly active users and $1 million revenue at the same time. It's just not going to work. work. And so make sure that you've done those things thoughtfully, and then test those theories. Don't be afraid to throw them out when it turns out it didn't work. And just continuous reassessment of those things. Definitely don't be afraid of the commercial conversation, and don't hide from it, because the default to hiding from it is you are answering those questions that you haven't posed yourself through every piece of engineering and every give you put into community, or whether you know it or not. And those positions can be hard to unwind from too.
Yeah.
Well put, in terms of externalizing your thinking and your assumptions to get better data than you can generate in your head. I would say beware the underprice and the overprice, and be prepared to experiment. I'll give two anecdotes, one from Heroku, one from Armory. So for Heroku, we charged like a lot more basically to run an LXC container in a virtualized private environment than we charged to do it, in a multi-tenanted way. And we thought that and it was a great product, great premium Heroku private spaces. But then we were like, okay, well, we'll charge like $1 quadrillion more to do it with, compliances on top. Well, there was a price premium there, but not as much as we thought maybe. Because once you're already operating at enterprise kind of scale and SLAs, security is kind of assumed to be built in. So we kind of overpriced there. Whereas in the Armory context, we're like, wow, this gigantic financial services institution wants to use our stuff. We should charge, it's like Dr. Evil, and, we will charge $1 million. Well, it turns out that's actually kind of an underprice in a way, because, those 5,000 developers we got for $1 million, they got 50,000 developers. So they would pay a lot more. So, there's going to be some turns of the crank when you're commercializing that are going to make you hugely uncomfortable, and you will screw some of it up. And you have to be able to iterate that model, that pricing model, as you evolve.
Great point, Luke.
Yeah, my innovation brings a new dimension of performance, to quote Peter Drucker. And when you're looking at build with your users, you got to be able to have the framework to fall back on, but focus on listening and being responsive to them. Communities by nature are exclusionary. People are in your community because they're passionate about the technology you're building or some other element. Listen to them, be responsive, build with them, empower them under the framework that you have. And also, last thing we didn't talk much about, don't under prioritize go to market. Don't just focus. If you might be so excited about all the amazing things your community is doing, you can just get into the weeds. But I think if you asked many people who have built similar companies at scale, they probably, especially if it's a product-led CEO or leadership, they're going to have, I should have prioritized GTM. Go to market responsibilities are going to go a long way. So that's my words of advice.
Margaret from Armory, thank you so much. Luke from HackerOne, thank you. Mark from HashiCorp, really appreciate y'all taking the time. This has been incredible. Really enjoyed this entire conversation and look forward to many more of them. Thank you.
Thanks so
Great
much.
job, Ashley. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley.